will soon see and hear 7 speakers representing as many different branches of the arts. These will include a painter, a journalist, an architect, an actor, an economist, economy being an art form today, an author, and a theologian. Theology was once known as the queen of the arts. We don't hear too much today about theologians, but they remain at the very top of the intellectual pyramid. And you are going to hear, in the beginning of these tapes, one of America's top flight theologians, Dr. R.J. Rushdoony, author of 30 books, inspirer of many thousands of people. I first encountered Rush's books when I had an office in San Diego. I was engaged in an intellectual search, and I found one of his books, I would say by accident if it were not for the fact that I'm a Christian, and found firm footing after many years of wandering. I hope that those of you who watch this tape, in this series of tapes, will find in what is said similar direction. Now I give you Dr. Rushdoony.
For all too many people in our time, Christian and non-Christian, the arts are seen as peripheral to life, not a necessity, a frill or a luxury. And the media is similarly regarded as scarcely anything more than a necessary evil. The fact is, both areas are essential to us as Christians. Because God created man in His image, man is created to be a molder and a shaper, who gives direction and meaning to all his activities in terms of the image of God in him. And because God, like the God He is, one who speaks, one who communicates a revelation to mankind, created man in His image to communicate, we have the media. Both are necessary expressions of the image of God in man. The arts are not peripheral. We all live in houses. We work in buildings. The clothing we wear, the pictures on our walls, all these are aspects of living, expressions of our life and our faith, of the values we cherish, and thus very important to life. We could not live without either the arts or the media communication. In the modern era, especially so in the 19th and 20th centuries, two basic motives have governed the world of art, so that as we consider now arts and the distortion of Christianity, is important for us to analyze these two basic motive forces. First has been the classical quest. This has been dominated by an adulation for Greek art and the ideals of Greek art. Now, the greatness of the classical motif has been the fact that it has been very intensely aware of the order of the universe. And this heritage it has bequeathed to the world as a constituent part of its outlook. Its fallacy with respect to order has been that it has seen it as something behind nature, although in nature. Ideas, universals, which somehow find expression in Platonic fashion in the material world. The Greek concept divided creation into ideas or universals and matter or particulars, so that the order was not in the material world, but in the ideal world, the world of universals. Not in God, not as a constituent part of nature. And this division led ultimately to a destruction of the classical sense of order. Greek art, as a result, aimed at expressing abstract universals, ideas which are beyond time and are not particulars, not a part of matter, but something which uses matter to express itself. In statuary, the goal was to portray not a woman, but ideal beauty, not an individual man, but the idea of man. As a result, in the classical tradition, the goal has been to produce great art, polished, finished, timeless art. Two examples of the classical idea in poetry can be cited: Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis and Shakespeare's The Rape of Lucrece. In these two works, Shakespeare tried to be classical. Reading those works is an exercise in boredom. Both are marked by a general irrelevance to life and thought as Shakespeare knew it. In his plays, Shakespeare was more relevant and less classical. In the sphere of literature again, Alexander Pope's Essay on Man is the great classical work in English literature, but his success was also his failure. The work shows a superficial and a pretentious nature. The continual striving for greatness rather than the expression of truth under God led the classical tradition step by step into absurdities. To cite another example, a man who in his day was regarded as one of the greats on a par with Shakespeare and others, Martin Tupper. In no way connected with Tupperware, but the same name. Martin Tupper is totally unknown today. But in the Victorian era, his fame was so great that it is hard to imagine that someone who was so highly regarded as one of the all-time greats could be so thoroughly forgotten today, so that nothing of his remains even in anthologies. In painting, the classical attitude led to transforming poor, run-down peasant dwellings into idyllic echoes of paradise. The classical ideal exalted the good, the true, and the beautiful, but as independent universals which somehow had to be seen as incarnating themselves in reality. This led to a choice of upper-class subjects. It led to an emphasis which distorted the real world. For example, 18th century French furnishings. if you examine a dining room table and the chairs, you realize why the habit developed whereby a gentleman would help a lady when she sat at table by moving the chair forward. The gentleman had to be a strong man to lift the chairs of the day. They were heavy, ornate works of art intended to express classical greatness. They were not very useful to sit on. And a woman could not handle it, and sometimes I suspect some older men wound up with a hernia after attempting to help a lady to the table. Now, this was what killed the classical ideal. It concentrated too much on greatness and too little on relevance. And we as Christians believe that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Not in a palace, but in a stable, in order to bring the whole of life into the kingdom of God, to radiate the whole of life with the salvation of God, the truth of God, and His grace. Reynolds, Gainsborough, and others in the classical tradition were exceptionally able men. But the ideal began to depart so from the real world that it reached the point of absurdity. When chairs became dining table chairs, so unwieldy that a woman could not cope with them, all we can say is they had left the world of reality. Things had become an end in themselves. The second motive, most often, but not exclusively associated with the avant-garde, has been for art to be prophetic. The artist as a prophet. He is his own prophet and his own Allah. So he is a prophet of himself. The artist has seen himself increasingly in this modern tradition as the true prophet of himself and given to unfettered, semi-mystical expressions of new truths, but formless, meaningless truths which amount simply to self-expression, whatever that might be. The artist became a poseur. Now, a poseur, in the true sense of the word, means someone who is called to raise fundamental questions, who poses questions. But the artist as poseur raised questions which had no answer by definition, because life is meaningless. Art is meaningless. There can be no answers. So the point of raising the questions was to drive home the ultimate meaninglessness of all things. One of the great figures in this tradition in the United States was Walt Whitman with his Leaves of Grass. He saw himself as a humanistic Christ figure. In fact, he had a photograph taken of himself in which he deliberately